Let's dive deeper into your gauge swatch. So your gauge swatch is something that is crucial to any knitted garment. This is going to determine how your sweater is going to end up fitting. Now I know a lot of beginner knitters are not sure about their gauge swatch. They're intimidated by the process, but let me tell you, it's very simple. Now let's break it down. First, you want to knit up a gauge swatch, which is a square 4" by 4". Now let me show you what that looks like. I have knit up a gauge swatch here for this particular design. Now, things to keep in mind when you're knitting up your gauge swatch is you want to knit it using the exact same raw materials as you are going to be using in your finished sweater. Now, what that means is I want you to use the exact same needles and exact same yarn. Now, don't go using a different type of needle, a different size of needle. This will all factor in to your gauge swatch. Now, the reason you want to do this is because you want to measure the exact same gauge as the designer. So we're going to take two different examples. If you have one person who's a very tight and stressful knitter, they are going to be knitting up their swatch very tight. If you have someone else who's very relaxed, very easygoing, they're knitting, their tension is going to be loose and too big. Even though they can use the exact same materials, the exact same yarns, and same needles, they need to have the same gauge to get the sweater to fit them perfectly. And how do you achieve this perfect gauge? You have to match the designer's gauge. Now, gauge can also be known as someone's handwriting. It's different for every person, and that's why your swatch is very important. Now, there's 3 different ways that this can go after you knit up your gauge swatch. You could get the tension absolutely perfect the first time. Your stitches and rows are perfect and you're ready to get cast on. The other 2 scenarios is where you'll need to play around with the needle size a little bit. So the first scenario is that you don't have enough stitches to meet gauge. What that would mean is that your needles are too big and your stitches are so big that you don't have enough stitches. So in that scenario, I would recommend going down a needle size, 1 or 2 needle sizes, depending. You can start playing around 1 needle size down and doing up your gauge swatch until you can match the stitches per inch. Now, the other scenario is that you would have too many stitches. So your needles are too small. In that case scenario, I would recommend going up the needle size to kind of enlarge those stitches so that they can match the gauge of the designer in the pattern. So you want to play around with those to meet the gauge. Now, I also recommend that you do up your gauge swatch the way that the designer has designed the pattern. A lot of people say, I don't know if I should knit my gauge in the round or flat. I'm not sure, the designer hasn't mentioned. If you go in the pattern and your pattern is worked in the round, you should be doing your gauge swatch in the round. If your pattern is knit flat in pieces and then seamed together, your gauge swatch should be knit flat. You want to make sure that you are knitting the exact same way as you would be the garment so that your gauge can be as accurate as possible. Now, I do recommend, depending on the type of garment, depending how big the garment is, you may want to check your gauge here and there during your pattern. As you knit up a sweater, depending on how heavy that yarn is, it can actually loosen up and change your gauge. So definitely check your needle sizes, take a little ruler every few inches or so. As you feel comfortable, check your gauge and modify your needles from there. Now, the other big question is, do I wet block my swatch? Do I wash it? What do I do? I always, always, always recommend to wash and block out your swatch as you would with your sweater. Because what can happen is, let's say that you didn't block it out. You knit up your entire sweater and it fits perfectly. You love the fit and everything. You go and you wet block it. That means that you submerge it in water with some wash and you wash it and you take it out, and all of a sudden your sweater is 2 sizes too big. It stretched it out so much, it relaxed the fibers in the water, and now you have a sweater that doesn't fit. And you're gonna think, Julie, I don't understand. I met the gauge. Why isn't my sweater fitting? What happens with different types of fibers is they can react differently once they are in water. So once you finish your gauge swatch, you can measure it before, that's all up to you. I submerge it in water and then I lay it out flat to dry the same way. I don't overstretch anything. I really just lay it out flat and I pin it out. I have a YouTube tutorial going over how to wet block your garments, how to pin it. I will link it below for you guys. You are gonna let that dry. Now, this could take up to 24 hours. I know it's not fun waiting, but if you really wanna make sure that your sweater is going to fit, I do recommend you take these steps. So, knit up your gauge swatch, block your gauge swatch. Once it's fully dry, then measure it. You will then know on your gauge if it's going to match. So, depending on the pattern, you are going to find two different measurements in your gauge. You are going to find the stitches, and you are also going to find the rounds. So what this means is when you go stitches, you are going lengthwise. So you're gonna say how many stitches per inch is going to do the circumference of your garment. This is the most important one to have. If you hit this one and not your row gauge, I don't care. I want you to hit your stitches per inch. That is the most important one because that will actually determine the circumference and the size of the garment. The rows per inch doesn't matter as much when you have a pattern that is going to say knit to this many inches or centimeters. Because if you, example, have less rounds, that just means that you're gonna knit a little bit more of your garment than I needed to. So that one is not as required. It could be a little bit off, but you definitely want your stitches per inch to be precise. If you have a garment on another pattern that says, you know, knit 18 rounds, then bind off, there you definitely want your rounds to be exact because you are not going based on measurements, you are going based on rounds. So I hope that helps you guys knitting your gauge swatch. Definitely get it swatched up, blocked, and I will meet you back here to cast on your sweater.